Racism remains a harsh reality for many Indians around the world, with discrimination taking various forms, from social exclusion to workplace bias, hate crimes, and even government policies that make life difficult. While India has strong cultural and economic ties with many nations, Indians living abroad often face racism due to stereotypes, historical tensions, and geopolitical factors. In 2025, some countries stand out for their extreme levels of discrimination against Indians, making them some of the most challenging places to live, work, or study. In this video, we will explore the top 10 countries where Indians face extreme racism in 2025. From verbal abuse and employment discrimination to violent xenophobic attacks, we will discuss how racism manifests in each country and why Indians struggle to find acceptance in these places. Whether it's due to deep-rooted prejudices, historical conflicts, or rising nationalist sentiments, these countries continue to be unwelcoming to the Indian community. If you are an Indian planning to move abroad for work, study, or travel, this list will help you stay informed and prepared. So, let's dive into the top 10 countries where Indians face extreme racism in 2025 and understand the challenges faced by Indians in these regions. 10. Italy. Italy has become an increasingly difficult place for Indian migrants, as racism and anti-immigrant sentiments have grown in recent years. Many Indians work in low-paying agricultural and factory jobs, often under exploitative conditions. Employers frequently underpay Indian workers and force them to work long hours with little legal protection. Racial discrimination is widespread, with many Italians viewing Indians as unwelcome outsiders. Indian workers have reported being verbally harassed in public, with racial slurs directed at them. Some have even faced physical violence from nationalist groups that oppose immigration. Indian students in Italy also struggle with integration. Many report being excluded from social activities and encountering racial biases in academic institutions. Some professors and classmates openly express prejudice against Indian students, making their educational experience challenging. Housing discrimination is another major problem. Landlords in Italy often refuse to rent to Indian tenants, citing stereotypes about hygiene and overcrowding. As a result, many Indians are forced to live in segregated migrant communities, limiting their opportunities for social and economic mobility. Despite Italy's rich history with diverse cultures, racism against Indians continues to be a significant issue. 9. Germany. Germany has seen a rise in racism against Indians, particularly in recent years as immigration has increased. Many Indians move to Germany for work or study, but they often face discrimination in housing, employment, and social settings. Indian students in German universities report being treated differently, with some professors and classmates displaying a lack of acceptance towards them. Racist remarks about Indian food, accents, and cultural habits are common. Many Indian students also struggle to find part-time jobs, as some employers prefer hiring Europeans. Housing discrimination is another major issue. Landlords in Germany are often reluctant to rent to Indians, citing stereotypes about overcrowding and hygiene. Many Indians are forced to live in specific areas with other migrants, limiting their integration into German society. Far-right nationalist groups in Germany have contributed to the rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, and Indians have become one of their targets. Hate crimes, including physical assaults and vandalism of Indian-owned businesses, have been reported. Although Germany has strict laws against racial discrimination, the lived experiences of many Indians suggest that racism remains a persistent problem in the country. 8. South Africa. South Africa has a significant Indian community, yet racism against Indians has been a long-standing issue. Despite their historical contributions to the country, many Indians face hostility from both black and white South Africans. This racism has deep historical roots, as Indians were brought to South Africa as indentured laborers during colonial rule. In recent years, xenophobic attacks targeting Indian businesses and residents have increased. Many black South Africans blame Indian shop owners for economic inequality, leading to violent riots and looting. Political figures have also fueled anti-Indian sentiments, accusing the Indian community of economic exploitation. Indians in South Africa report facing discrimination in employment and government policies. Affirmative action laws, meant to address racial inequality, sometimes disadvantage Indians, prioritizing black South Africans for jobs and government contracts. In addition, racial slurs and derogatory terms targeting Indians are still commonly used in everyday conversations. While South Africa promotes multiculturalism, the reality for many Indians is different. With ongoing racial tensions and economic struggles, the Indian community in South Africa continues to face systemic racism and social exclusion. 7. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a large Indian workforce, particularly in the construction and service industries. However, many Indians in the country face extreme discrimination due to the strict labor hierarchy and racial biases against South Asians. Indian laborers often work in harsh conditions, with little legal protection from exploitation. Reports of physical abuse, withheld wages, and inhumane living conditions are common. The kafala system, which ties workers to their employers, makes it difficult for Indian migrants to escape abusive situations. Many Indian workers are treated as second-class citizens, facing restrictions in mobility and access to basic rights. Even educated Indian professionals in Saudi Arabia report discrimination, as locals are often given preference for high-paying jobs. Social discrimination is also widespread. Many Saudis look down on Indians, considering them inferior due to their nationality and ethnicity. Indian women in Saudi Arabia face additional challenges, including restrictions on dress and behavior, making it difficult to live freely. While Saudi Arabia continues to rely on Indian labor, the treatment of Indians in the country remains highly discriminatory and exploitative. 6. Russia. Russia has a history of racism against foreigners, and Indians are no exception. While Indian students and workers have been coming to Russia for decades, they often face discrimination in public spaces, workplaces, and even educational institutions. Many Indians report experiencing racial slurs and hate crimes, especially in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Skin color plays a significant role in the discrimination faced by Indians in Russia. Darker-skinned individuals are often subjected to racial insults, and some even face violence from nationalist groups. Indian students studying medicine or engineering in Russia have reported frequent harassment, with locals stereotyping them as inferior or unwelcome. Indians working in Russia also face challenges in employment. Many companies hesitate to hire Indians for high-paying jobs, preferring to employ Russian or European workers instead. Additionally, law enforcement in Russia often profiles Indian immigrants, assuming they are involved in illegal activities. The ongoing geopolitical tensions between India and Russia, particularly regarding alliances and trade agreements, have only worsened public perception of Indians. Despite historical diplomatic ties, racism in Russia remains a significant issue for the Indian diaspora. 5. China. China has historically had a complex relationship with India, and racism against Indians remains a serious issue. Many Indians living in China, particularly students and business professionals, report experiencing discrimination in daily life. Due to geopolitical tensions between the two nations, Chinese citizens often view Indians with suspicion, associating them with border disputes and economic competition. Indian students in Chinese universities frequently face racial prejudice. They are often mocked for their skin color and cultural practices, and some struggle to integrate into local social groups. Many Indian businesses in China also report unfair treatment, with local authorities favoring Chinese competitors. Additionally, Indian professionals often find it difficult to secure high-ranking positions in Chinese companies, as employers tend to prefer hiring locals. The COVID-19 pandemic further worsened attitudes toward Indians in China, with many facing racial slurs and blame for spreading diseases, much like how Africans were treated in Guangzhou. Some Indians have even been denied entry to public places like restaurants and malls. Anti-Indian sentiment in China is deeply rooted in political and historical conflicts, making it one of the most challenging places for Indians to live and work. 4. United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a large Indian community, but racism against Indians has escalated due to growing anti-immigrant sentiment. Many Indians in the UK report facing discrimination in the workplace, particularly in high-paying sectors like finance and healthcare. Some employers still hold colonial-era biases against Indians, leading to unfair treatment and limited career progression. Indian students in British universities frequently encounter racism, both from fellow students and faculty members. Many report being excluded from social activities and experiencing derogatory remarks about their culture and food. Hate crimes against Indians have also increased, with attacks on Indian-owned businesses and Hindu temples becoming more common. Brexit has worsened the situation, with many British citizens blaming immigrants, including Indians, for economic struggles. The rise of far-right nationalist groups has contributed to the hostility, with slogans like, "Take back our country," being directed at Indian immigrants. Housing discrimination is another major issue, with many landlords refusing to rent to Indian tenants. Despite the UK's reputation for multiculturalism, Indians still face systemic racism in various aspects of life, making it a challenging environment for many. 3. Australia. Australia has had a long history of racism against Indians, particularly international students and workers. Despite being a popular destination for Indian migrants, racism remains deeply rooted in Australian society. Indian students frequently report facing verbal abuse, physical attacks, and exclusion from social groups. Some have even been victims of violent hate crimes, particularly in cities like Melbourne and Sydney. Workplace discrimination is another major issue. Many Indian professionals struggle to secure jobs that match their qualifications, as employers often prefer hiring Australians. Racial bias in recruitment processes is common, leading many Indians to take up low-paying jobs despite holding advanced degrees. The housing market is also discriminatory, with many landlords unwilling to rent to Indian tenants. The rise of far-right nationalism in Australia has further fueled anti-Indian sentiments. Many Australians believe that Indian immigrants are taking over job opportunities and contributing to overcrowding in cities. Social media platforms have become breeding grounds for racist comments and hate speech against Indians. The Australian government has taken steps to address racial discrimination, but many Indians still face significant challenges in terms of safety, employment, and social acceptance. 2. United States. The United States has a significant Indian diaspora, but racism against Indians has been a persistent issue, worsening in recent years. Many Indian professionals, particularly in the tech industry, have faced workplace discrimination, with employers favoring local workers over Indian immigrants. Hate crimes against Indians have risen, with incidents of verbal abuse, physical attacks, and vandalism targeting Indian businesses and places of worship. Indian students in U.S. universities often experience racial prejudice, facing exclusion from social circles and being subjected to offensive stereotypes. Many are mocked for their accents and cultural practices. Housing discrimination is also common, with landlords in certain areas refusing to rent to Indians. Some neighborhoods, especially in the southern and midwestern states, have seen a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, making it unsafe for Indian residents. Additionally, racial profiling by law enforcement disproportionately affects Indians, particularly Sikhs, who are often mistaken for Middle Eastern individuals due to their turbans. The political climate has contributed to this hostility, with immigration policies tightening and some American politicians blaming immigrants, including Indians, for job losses. While the U.S. offers immense opportunities, the increasing racial discrimination against Indians remains a serious concern. 1. Canada. Canada has traditionally been welcoming to Indian immigrants, but in recent years, racial discrimination against them has intensified. Hate crimes against South Asians have surged, with reports of harassment, racial slurs, and even physical assaults becoming more frequent. Between 2019 and 2022, hate crimes targeting Indians increased by 143%. Many Indian students and workers report facing discrimination in housing and employment, with landlords and employers often preferring non-Indian tenants and employees. Diplomatic tensions between India and Canada have worsened the situation. The Khalistan issue has further fueled resentment against the Indian diaspora, with accusations of political interference creating divisions within Canadian society. Online hate speech targeting Indians has doubled, with far-right groups blaming them for issues like rising housing costs and job shortages. Additionally, incidents of gang violence involving Indian youth have led to increased racial profiling by law enforcement. Indian students, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, have reported being unfairly targeted by police. While Canada still upholds multicultural values, systemic racism in daily life is a growing challenge for the Indian community. The Indian government has even issued advisories warning citizens about the risks of living in Canada due to rising hostility.